Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
the Americas as a whole represent half the cases and almost half the deaths in the whole world. If you look at Brazil, it represents quite a proportion of all the cases. We cannot continue to allow the fight against this virus to become and be sustained as an ideologic fight. We cannot beat this virus with ideologies.
The World Health Organization's Dr. Mike Ryan says Brazil faces a complex challenge in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. With 1.4 million cases and over 60,000 deaths, it now ranks as the second worst hit country in the world after the United States. And the numbers may be understated. In early June, the country's health ministry took down the website which reported cumulative numbers, sparking accusations that the data was being manipulated. Meanwhile, President Jair Bolsonaro has criticised lockdown and social distancing measures and accused the media of creating panic. But the country's economy will not suffer as much as some of its neighbours in the region, following generous fiscal and monetary policy. I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm joined by ING's Chief Economist for Latin America, Gustavo Rangel, to discuss what the outbreak and the policy response mean for the country and for the region. Gustavo, the political response to the crisis in Brazil has been criticised by some. States are partially reopening, but cases are still going up. They stopped reporting numbers for a while. There's still no permanent health minister. Is there a coherent strategy to deal with this crisis?
Well, you're right. The government's response has been quite controversial. Like Trump in the US or the Mexican president, the Brazilian president has also tried to balance the need to maintain social distancing, the need to fight the virus, but at the same time, with the conflicting message that, the damage to the economy is something that people should have in the back of their minds. So that has been an inherent part of why they've behaved in such an inconsistent fashion. I would say that ultimately that may have hurt Brazil's image abroad. It may have added to the number of caseloads that Brazil has faced, and certainly that is negative. But ultimately, what we are seeing now is that cases continue to rise, but economies are reopening, and there was very significant differences between how states reacted to it. Even though Bolsonaro gets the headlines, the important thing is to keep in mind that states that saw the biggest rise in COVID also responded with great urgency in implementing quite strict social distancing measures. So it was a very different responses across the country. I wouldn't say that Bolsonaro's leadership played such an overwhelming role in determining how states behaved. And so there's a lot of differences across Brazil as to how states responded. But nonetheless, I think the most damaging thing here is the extent that Bolsonaro's controversies have affected Brazil's image and to what extent that has resulted in a much more volatile and negative perception by investors regarding Brazil.
Right. Well, even before this crisis hit, things weren't looking particularly good for Bolsonaro. He was elected partly because he was going to fight corruption, but he himself has been involved in various scandals. There was a real risk of impeachment. Has the virus taken the focus away from that for now?
I would not say that because, after all, there are pending cases regarding his son in the Supreme Court right now, and there is significant vulnerability there for the president. My view, however, is that given that Brazil has faced such frequent political turmoils in the past, including the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, a very tumultuous tenor by the former president Temer, I see very little appetite, from the political institutions to engage in institutional disputes of that kind. I don't see necessarily Congress or the Supreme Court with a desire to create even more conflict than we already have. I would also say that even though Bolsonaro has lost popularity, he maintains a relatively solid base of like 25, 30% of the population. And I think that is a very important point to keep in mind that typically suggests that in terms of the impetus for political parties or even the Supreme Court to engage in something very serious is going to be a little more difficult. When impeachment happened in the past, it happened in the context of extremely unpopular presidents. Impeachment is a political process. Of course, they are based on real facts that involve some kind of not necessarily fraud, but mismanagement or things of that nature. But ultimately, they're political processes that require the support of society and political parties for it to happen. And I don't see that happening in Brazil.
Okay. Just give us a sense of how badly the economy has been hit from COVID-19. Which sectors are hurting the most, and what are you expecting in terms of growth this year?
Consensus is that Brazil is going to have a recession of about 6.5%. That is a bit, I would say, in the better range for the region, for LATAM. The region is going to see very severe recessions in Peru, for instance. That is one of the most affected countries by COVID. That should contract 12, 13%. Argentina, that is in the middle of a very important debt negotiation, is also going to contract quite substantially, possibly more than 10%. Mexico is going to contract as well, quite substantially. Let's say, I think consensus is around 9%. So Brazil, I think, is in the company of potentially Chile and Colombia there, that we're going to see a milder contraction. This is likely a result of the fact that COVID cases as a percentage of the population are relatively smaller in these countries that are recovering a bit faster. And the other factor here is policy stimulus. Policy stimulus was not uniform throughout LATAM. You've had very strong policy stimulus taking place in places like Chile, Peru, that were especially affected by COVID. And you had very strong policy responses in Brazil as well. Colombia and Mexico, especially Mexico, did not provide much in terms of stimulus, so that will impact their recovery prospects as well. As far as sectors that have been especially impacted, it's similar, like everywhere. Service sectors that have been impeded from functioning, they are the most affected. Certainly travel industry and hotels, all of that has been affected tremendously. Exporters, though, especially on the agriculture side, such as what you have a lot in Brazil, they have benefited quite a bit because FX rates, they have weakened a lot, and that has, of course, increased their revenues in local currency terms. So there were winners and losers, I would say. But overall, the recovery will depend on how fast economies reopen and to what extent the policy stimulus implemented so far will be effective at limiting the permanent damage that obviously occurred throughout the region.
Well, what sorts of measures have governments taken to combat the fallout, and what sort of monetary stimulus? I know that Brazil has cut interest rates to a record low. Is there room to do more?
I would say monetary policy was actually the most used, and perhaps, certainly in the case of Brazil, perhaps the most effective tool they had to implement counter-cyclical stimulus here. In the case of Brazil, as you mentioned, rates have dropped from an average of 10% in the past 10 years to 2.25 now, and the central bank has signaled that they may cut a little bit more to perhaps 2%. Anyway, this is by far the lowest Brazil has ever had. Chile and Peru and Colombia also right now have the lowest interest rates that they've ever had. In the case of Peru is 0.25, in the case of Chile 0.5, in the case of Colombia 2.5. These are the lowest they've ever had. Colombia and Brazil, like I said before, they have a little bit more space to cut, not a lot. Like I said, in Brazil, the technical minimum there, I think is considered to be 2% or 175. I think Colombia will be also very reluctant to drop rates below 2%. But in the case of Peru and Chile, they are already at the lower bound. Mexico is the outlier here, where the overnight rate is still at the level similar to historical average, near 5%. So that is the one country that has not implemented much in terms of policy stimulus whatsoever. All countries have also introduced some measure of fiscal policy. Of course, there's very limited resources for many of these countries. So this is a much more problematic source of counter-cyclical policy effort. Brazil has done quite a bit, just like Chile and Peru. Colombia has done a bit less, and Mexico also, once again, surprised by doing very little. So we're going to see very different economic performances in every country, also based on how different these efforts were. But regardless, what we're going to see, no matter how much or how little you spend in terms of fiscal stimulus, there's going to be a widespread increase in debt for Latin countries. And that is something that I think will trigger a lot of concern, investor concern later in the year, once we know exactly to what extent the damage was. And then what these countries will do as a result of this very massive increase in debt, I think it's something that will be very important for investors to decide on which countries they think will do better and which countries they think the risk should be higher.
And does that change the long-term prospects for the region?
Certainly. I think how these countries deal with this sharp increase in debt is, I think, probably the most important driver for future performance. We're likely to see credit rating downgrades throughout the region, but as of right now, it's still extremely uncertain because we don't know the extent of the recession and we don't know the extent of the policy stimulus that is even being implemented. So we are still in the early stages of this assessment, but certainly we're likely to see a lot of important developments here on the fiscal policy front, and certainly a lot of action when it comes to credit rating agencies. That's become especially important in the case of Colombia, that's still an investment grade, and Mexico, because both of them are going to suffer recession and sharp increases in debt. And especially, they could lose their investment grade rating. So that is a big concern.
Okay, Gustavo Rangel, ING's Chief Economist for Latin America. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Rebecca.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, and nor is it investment, legal, or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-disclaimer.